Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming today to my guest lecture. I'd first like to begin by thanking Professor Bloom for her kind and generous introduction, and of course for the invitation to come here and talk to you today. And by extension, as she mentioned, I'm a guest, I'm a visitor in the department, so thank you once again for your generous accommodation. So, as was mentioned before, I'm working on this project, this ERC funded project. We're coming to the end of that now, and it's actually about Chinese financed infrastructure development across Europe, and particularly in 4 countries, of which Hungary is one. Germany is another one, Greece is a third, and the UK is the final one. And we're trying to understand trying to move away from this binary good West versus bad East thinking into more understanding what this means for development in the European context. At the same time, Hungary is a country which I kind of by accident have come to know quite a lot about. So what I'm about to present to you is a little bit lifted from previous research I've done. It's a little bit lifted from the book, which will come out in July, and it's also imbued with new research, which I hope you'll find interesting. So what I'm going to do is first of all, I'm going to try and paint a little bit of a picture for you. I don't know how familiar you are with this particular country. Is anyone from Hungary in here?
Speak a little bit louder.
A little bit louder. Oh, that's right. Okay, I'll try my best to do that. So, has anyone been there? 1, 2, a few people. Okay, so you're familiar with this building, perhaps the most famous building in the capital city, this neo-Gothic Parliament. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly run you through the slight development trajectories and energy makeup of the country during the state socialist period. Then we're going to talk briefly about this intermittent 2 decades between the end of the socialist period and, as Professor Bloom mentioned, when Fidesz and Orbán returned to government in 2010, so almost 15 years ago already. Then I want to talk about Hungary and the East. I'm always putting this East and West in inverted commas because on their own, they seem to me anyway to be highly loaded terms. And I don't want to provide you with some kind of stereotypical journalistic half-truth, but rather just bracket them and leave them as an open question. I want to then talk about some of the literature which I've used in my own research and which you might find useful in yours. Which I'm labeling here ideological inflections, and particularly Hungarian authoritarian populism, which is a term I made up, but it's built on someone else's work, which I will also talk about. I then would like to talk about the kind of capitalists and the kind of capital which these capitalists seek. I will go into that a little bit in more detail, and then I want to present to you 2 empirical studies on energy makeup in this country. One is this Paksh 2. It's a nuclear power plant extension, mostly financed by a Russian state loan. And the second one is CATL. I can't remember exactly what that stands for, but it's written in here somewhere. But it's the world's largest battery manufacturer, and it's Chinese. And this is a $7-something billion investment. And then I will conclude. All right, so as you all know, Hungary is a small landlocked country, and after 1945, as a defeated power, it was not just in the urban areas, but also in the rural areas, absolutely destroyed. And so to build this country back up, which still remains quite a rural economy, really, with only one major city. It took many decades to do that. At the same time, there were a lot of shocks in the country, most notably this quite famous 1956 revolution or counter-revolution, whichever way you look at it, where hundreds of thousands of people left the country. And the capital city and other cities were again destroyed. Not as much as during the war, but again, there was a lot of more reconstruction to do, which obviously cost a lot of money. In the 1960s, there was this effort to reorganize the economy, which is called the New Economic Mechanism, which is a half-baked attempt to slightly marketize the economy. This is the same year of the Prague Spring. So in this part of Central Europe, at least in socialist Central Europe, that year, well, not just, but also in Western Europe as well, that year was quite a monumental change. However, I don't want to give you the idea that this NEM, New Economic Mechanism, was revolutionary. It was not. It was, as I said, it was a half-baked effort to change things, which ultimately did not really work. But the most important factor came with regard to the political economy development came in the 1980s. So just in a few years before the change, the systemic change. And this was the growth of both net debt and gross debt in the country. And this, excuse me, this data here, you can see in just 4 years, it's almost doubled. These are almost doubled. So this was an enormous strain on that particular economy. Of course, this is not an isolated case, but vis-a-vis its socialist Central European peers at that time, it was relatively high. The knock-on effects of this were quite a restrained set of policy choices regarding this debt. Of course, this coincides with the nomenclatura at that time becoming very, very old. Physically old, and they were quite literally dying out. Not just in this country again, but this was just another example of that. So how far that contributed to this new thinking is an interesting question as well. At the same time, there were Hungarian economists during this period who were being educated in the West and then coming back to Hungary and bringing these ideas with them about how to think about this debt refinancing, etc. Within the country itself, there were higher expectations around the better quality of living standards, which is quite a normal thing to do. But then, of course, if your economy is heavily indebted, in order to produce higher and higher living standards all the time, you need to borrow more and more, which becomes an impossible kind of situation. Quite an interesting thing, actually, is some research done a few years ago now about private market under socialist conditions. In essence, this was a kind of experiment, and I will mention this later. But at this time as well, in the late 1980s, it's not exactly clear how many, but it's something like 25,000 Chinese migrated to Hungary, the largest group of Chinese into the region. And this was an idea from Deng Xiaoping to see what Chinese life would look like working in the private market under socialist conditions. So already there is a connectivity between China and Hungary, even at this relatively early stage. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Another little statistic, which I think is really indicative here, is you can see an absolute explosion in just 12 months in small and medium enterprises. So this is effectively private business, right? And so, you know, it's easier to say this in hindsight, but looking at this data, it seems like if we could go back to 1988, 1989, it would seem somehow that the writing was on the wall. Of course, there were no guarantees, but it seems that this was a change waiting to happen in effect. Reflecting, again, this is about energy, so I want to talk about that just briefly. No surprises. Hungary was absolutely almost 100% dependent on inward transfers of minerals from the Soviet Union, and now its major successor state, Russia. And one of the reasons is Hungary is a landlocked country, as I've mentioned, and as you all know, and it has absolutely negligible natural resources of its own, unlike, say, Romania or Serbia or Ukraine, three of its bordering countries. Moving on to the second sort of period, if you like, so the state socialist system has gone. Representative democracy has arrived. How much quality that is a different question, but it has arrived, and market capitalism is beginning to be developed in this country now. As I've already mentioned, the debt was such an enormous problem that it's not just that the creditors disappeared, the debt rolled over into this period, and this had to be addressed at some stage or another. So in 1995, one of the ministers, this is named after him, Bokros, he was a minister in the government at that time, which was a socialist government, by the way. They introduced this very strict austerity program. It's come to be known as the Bokros package. And here are some of the immediate effects. This is the currency, Hungarian forint. Immediately, this is overnight. It lost 9% of its value. So effectively, if you were there, you got 9% poorer from one day to another. A huge surcharge was applied to imports, and real wages plummeted by 12%. So not only did your assets lose a lot, you earned less. So this was a big impact on the general population. On the positive side, if I can put it that way, there was a reduction in foreign debt liabilities. So again, that was the whole reason to address this debt. Improvement in the balance of trade and increase in the public finances. So obviously this is music to the ears of the creditors, right? So that was ultimately why this was implemented. As I'm sure we all know, successive governments sold large sections of the economy to private buyers. Obviously, this is not an isolated case, but this is across the region. It's still continuing today. Different countries have had different policy choices around that. But Hungary, in Hungary, it tended to be quite liberal. So they were quite, in favour of selling off these state assets. Quite interestingly, actually, there was a kind of a territorial division. So German firms, which I'll talk probably quite a lot about later, tended to focus on the northwest of the country. The French firms moved to the south. So I don't know how much they got together and decided, okay, you go here, you go there. I don't know, but it's quite interesting. Incidentally, there is a wonderful political economist on the region, Dorothee Bohler, who I'm sure you know, whom I met about a few years ago, and she had a similar kind of data set, which was much wider, which was about how Western firms moved into their old empires in the region. So Finnish firms went to Estonia, Swedish firms went to the other Baltic countries, Greek firms went to Bulgaria, etc., etc., etc. So it's quite interesting how these things were divided up. Here's a little bit of data just to reflect kind of what I've been talking about. These are just some of the selected countries, not all of them, but you can see this is from 1994, so there's a few years after the change. 30% of the entire GDP was FDI stock, so that's an enormous amount of exposure to not just Western, but there were also Japanese firms and Korean firms as well who entered this country. So, I mean, Poland is second, but Poland has a population of something like 45 million. Hungary is like 9. So you can't really compare them in size. That's why it's much less there. And so this is just to give you some idea of what happened with FDI influx. Here is some selected energy data I've taken from quite a large period, stepping over the end of the 80s, so the systemic change. you can see here, Hungary, it's gone from, so this is the Bokros package, as I mentioned, 1995. So it's gone from completely public to mixed. There isn't another one on there who's done that. The only other one is Luxembourg, but I don't know much about the Luxembourgish energy makeup. I imagine it's quite small. So these are obviously policy choices. So they haven't gone completely private like the UK had or Germany had, but they've decided to mix that. So there is mixed ownership there. People, for such a small country, it seems to me, this it gets a lot of media attention. I don't know really why. Probably because the media likes to talk about, it likes to reify enemies quite often. But Fidesz doesn't keep winning again and again and again just because it cheats at elections. It has genuine policy and policy choices. Sorry, you may not be able to see it very clearly, but this is household expenditure in 2011. So this is the year after Fidesz came back. This is the largest point. So this is 26 something percent? And this is on energy. So 26%, if you lived there at that time, of your salary was going just on basically making your house warm, having electricity, the things that you kind of take for granted, right? So this is extremely high. And so one of Fidesz's most popular policies during this period was to reduce these energy costs. And here you can see they managed to do that for households over a 4-year period, gone down, and industry. So they weren't just catering to households, but also to business as well. This is part of the reason why they've been so successful. So how they did that is not entirely clear. But nonetheless, this shows that the costs for energy expenditure decreased fairly significantly. And this policy contributed to their second victory in 2014. So now I would like to talk about Hungary again and the East, and especially Russia and China. So during the preceding 2 decades before Fidesz returned to power, the relations with these, especially Russia, was not really hostile, but it was rather pragmatic, because their entire kind of focus, especially in foreign policy, was about developing relations with the West, right? So in 1999, they joined NATO. In 1996, they joined the OECD. In 2004, they joined the European Union, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, and opening up trade and all the things that come with that, but also continuing to service that debt, which I've already mentioned. Regarding China, Hungary was the first country in the region to recognize the People's Republic of China in 1949. And then in 2003, it was the first country, again from the region, to reanimate diplomatic and political relations with China. This is in 2003 when the then Prime Minister and some colleagues of his, I suppose, had a high-level diplomatic envoy to Beijing. This was and remains highly appreciated by Chinese parties. And this is one of the reasons why Sino-Hungarian relations remain strong today, and much stronger than they are in, say, Poland or Slovakia. So this is actually quite a significant development. So diplomacy does pay, that's for sure. I would like to kind of focus your attention on this policy. So they call it Eastern Opening, is the English translation of the Hungarian. And this began 12 years ago, and it's ongoing. And essentially the idea is to stimulate business, trade relations, investor relations, etc., with countries, with states and private firms geographically located to the east of the country, so essentially non-EU countries. So Russia and China fall firmly within this purview, but also there are Central Asian countries, Turkey, for example, Azerbaijan, etc., etc., etc. So it's quite a list. How tangible they are is not always clear. However, there are some tangible results. Quite a well-known one now is this Belgrade-Budapest railway upgrade. This was mostly financed by a Chinese loan. We don't know how much this is now because the entire details were codified in 2020. So we don't exactly know how much that costs, but it would have gone up due to inflationary pressures after COVID. There's also the development of Huawei in the country. Huawei, this Chinese telecoms firm, which we mentioned briefly before, has become a bit of a taboo word, but nonetheless, something like 70% of Hungarians either directly or indirectly use Huawei. So it's very difficult to eject that particular company out of the telecoms network. That's a slightly different topic. And then there's another two tangible results, the two which I will talk about later. Importantly, there are also intangible results. And the most important, in my opinion, is the development of what two very good Hungarian sociologists have described as a kind of ideological coalition between post-communist countries. I don't agree with their entire thesis, but it's pretty interesting what they have to say. And then again, regarding energy, as I mentioned already, Hungary, even today, I mean, since the war began in almost 2 years ago, there's no data forthcoming, at least not that I could find. So this slightly predates that. So this is from 2020, and 90% of gas, just for example, arrives from Russia. So this is the third highest in the EU, ahead even of two of the Baltic countries. So there's a major dependency remains there. So I want to talk about, just briefly, these Russo-Hungarian economic relations. Basically, the Paks 2 nuclear power plant extension notwithstanding, they're essentially negligible. They basically don't exist. So you can see the statistic again. This is a little bit older, but Germany's FDI into Hungary. One could say that Germany essentially owns the Hungarian political economy to a large extent. Whereas, you can't really compare that. It's nothing. One of the reasons is there's simply no space for Russian capital to enter the Hungarian political economy, because either it's already in foreign hands, or it's owned by domestic capitalists who do not wish to relinquish the asset, whatever it is. The imports dropped significantly since Russia annexed Crimea. It seems like a long time ago now, but so 10 years ago. So even before then, it was very, very small. And as you can see here, this really reflects it. So it's under 1% of the total. So this is why I think it's important to talk about the ideological aspects of these relationships, because it's not just you can't just talk about it from a pragmatic, rational business point of view of this capital coming in and what it means just for the revenue streams. So this just hopefully gives you an idea of these economic relations. With regard to China, again, a little bit like Russia, there's quite little space for capital entry, and when it does enter, it tends to be quite major projects. So I've already mentioned, and I will talk about this later, this CATL investment, which is now the largest Chinese investment in the entire region. In 2010, a Chinese company, Wanhua, bought a Hungarian chemicals company for something like €3 billion, which was at that time the largest in the region. So they tend to be quite large. But what I want to talk about later is batteries as the kind of latest sort of technology, and this really has come to dominate what this is my term, the Chinese, German, Hungarian tripartite. So I will talk about that a little bit more later. But before I do, I want to discuss the kind of ideology that we sort of see in this country. Recent literature, when I say recent, I mean over the last 10 years or so, has talked a lot about ideology in this particular country. In my opinion, a lot of focus on Hungary. There's almost kind of too much of it. I'm a bit guilty because I've contributed that to myself. But there's so many expressions and terminologies that fly around trying to capture the ideological developments in this country and elsewhere, that it's hard to kind of get them all into one box. I think I need an entire presentation just to talk to you about that. But from the literature, I've lifted 4 of them, and all of them apply to Hungary in some sense, some to others. But they all kind of have different key features, as you can see. Some think they're very unstable. I don't. I think it's actually extremely stable, what's going on there. Some talk about social obligations, ethnocultural similarity. This is actually quite a good paper. They're all good, but this one is quite convincing. This one is something quite close to what I'm trying to talk about. This is a Weberian term, prebendalism, which is a kind of sociological organizational structure, which is similar to patrimonialism but slightly different. But it's basically where you have the person at the top. So in this case, it would be Orban, and if you're a business person in Hungary, you can have your assets, you can have your property, but the trade-off is you have to be completely loyal to the regime. So this is something close to what I'm talking about, and this is also a very good paper. What I really like is this final paper, because it becomes international. So they actually look to the European Union and say, well, actually, fine, you have these particular developments in Hungary or maybe even elsewhere, but actually we can't overlook the EU's role in all of this, because they play a structuring role, mainly through transfers, but also through legitimation, etc. So these are all quite convincing attempts to kind of capture the type of ideology that has been under development in Hungary, at least for the last 14 years, if not longer. However, as is in my profession, I don't completely agree with that. So I've decided to develop this slightly. And the person whose work I build on in particular is the wonderful cultural theorist who passed away about 10 years ago. And one of my probably all-time intellectual heroes, Stuart Hall, who developed the concept of authoritarian populism. I don't know what stage you are at in your work, but I strongly recommend that you read some of his work, because even though he was writing in the 1970s and 80s, his work, in my opinion, is applicable to many of our contemporary politics today. He writes, what is authoritarian populism? What he was trying to do was kind of conceptualize what he himself termed Thatcherism. So he was working in the United Kingdom, right? So what he himself termed Thatcherism. So what he saw about Thatcherism was something extremely unique, which hadn't really happened in the world before. And so he saw it coming. He writes, authoritarian populism is an exceptional form of the capitalist state. This is important, the capitalist state, which, unlike classical fascism, has retained most, though not all, of the formal representative institution in place. he's talking about the institutions of state. He's not just talking about the police and the military, but he's also talking about the media, right? And to which at the same time has been able to construct around itself an active popular consent, the media. So there's an active popular consent. So you have the politics of the day captured as authoritarian populism, which is kind of, in his term, buttressed from above and below by the state and by popular aspects of civil society. I've already mentioned the media, but you could also add celebrityism, tabloid press, sport, etc. So this is a cross-conjunctural terrain of sociological development, which I find very useful and have found very useful for thinking through what exactly is going on in Hungary. Before I get to that, I want to elaborate a little bit on authoritarian populism and its relationship with capital, because they're not separate. So they must come together. As I mentioned, he's talking about Thatcherites, right? We have the ability now to look back on that period of history and say things like, oh yeah, that was obvious what they were doing. You know, it's no surprise that they were working in conjunction with big business and what we have today, etc. But this wasn't obvious at that time. So, and he was the one, again, who brought this to the popular imagination. So it's a global expansion of capitalism, which is exactly what happened. And of course, after the systemic change in 1989, that global expansion of capitalism globalized itself even more. We all know the story. So again, this is a bit of a Gramscian jargon from Antonio Gramsci, but this is a conjunctural terrain, right? So it's when there's a particular moment in history. In the Hungarian case, this is not just when Fidesz came back to power in 2010, but this was in 2002 when they lost the election, because they were in government between 98 and 2002, but it was very ideologically different then. They were quite a standard centre-right party at that time. But when they lost the election, that's when they began to unify and work out how they could extend their time in power. Just as with authoritarian populism in the Thatcherite case in UK, Thatcher came to power in 1979, but she had been leader of the Conservative Party since 1975. So he goes back to that point, right? Just as I'm going back to the time before they came to power. So, and again, part of the content of authoritarian populism is what he calls moral panics. So this is where you kind of blame somebody or something for something not going right. We would call that, broadly speaking, kind of populist rhetoric now. But think of things like immigrants or bankers or these kind of things. It seems like a bit of a cheap thing to throw around, but it's extremely effective, because what comes after you declare a moral panic? A common sense reaction amongst the population. So what is the common sense reaction to immigration? Well, if you are in government and you want to use immigration to leverage your legitimacy or your power, etc., the common sense reaction induced would be, okay, we need to do something about this, whatever the policy choice we are. So that's just an example. Again, as I've said already, this, in my opinion, is applicable to Hungary, and I'll now labour and try and show you why. I'm a bit conscious of time, sorry. Hungary is a very unusual country. It's not often around the world you can have a government that basically keeps winning elections. It's now won 4 consecutive elections. Certainly not in the. I'm trying to think in the European Union. Maybe Merkel won 4, right? But she wasn't the chancellor at some period before that. So it's a very unusual case. It's also unusual in terms of the state-business relations because of this, as I mentioned, this prebendal system which is developed in Hungary. I realise there's a lot of jargon coming today, so please bear with me. But as I mentioned, so all I've done is I've thrown the word Hungarian in front of this to develop my own concept, and it contains the emergence of Hungarian politics as a form of hegemonic politics. We talked a little bit about this on Monday, and there's this hegemonic, another Gramscian term, is a little bit of a loaded term and can be used erroneously. However, as I mentioned, the Hungarian government is basically so powerful, nothing can really happen in that country in developmental terms unless the big boss kind of wills it. Second is recognition of the government's relations and reconfigurations of domestic capital. I won't go into this too much because there's already been some work on it. But as I mentioned, between 2002 and 10, 8 years in opposition, during that time, they laid the groundwork of what they assumed would be a longer term period in office. It has turned out like that. But one of the ways they did that was to co-opt big business, basically. Something that they failed to do in their first time in office between 1998 and 2002, as I mentioned. So to make this successful, they've got the domestic capital on their side, essentially. And then third, this is a combination of one and two. They become consolidated, so these 2 points, and then they're able to alter the state structures and the trajectory of capitalist development, right? And this is really the point. This is one of the reasons why they've been so successful. How Hungary now is nothing like the country it was 14 years ago, and there's no going back to that period. That's for sure. I won't go through the next table too much, but it's just indicative. It's just to show you some ideas of some examples of the moral panics which I mentioned. So colonization, otherness, immigration, I've already mentioned, specific threats. And again, these kind of reified into existence common sense reaction. It's not very complicated, but it's tremendously effective. How they're able to do that. Again, these are just some examples. Now, I would like to talk about the second kind of theoretical aspect, which kind of informs this particular research I've been doing, and that in which I build on a book which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and actually I think has maybe one of the best book covers I've ever seen. So this is Making Capitalism About Capitalists, it's called, and this was published in 1998. I mean, this is, you can see 2 women, it's obviously very cold, and they seem to be selling fish. One would imagine, I don't exactly know where this is, but somewhere in post-fascist Europe, I would suppose. One would imagine that just a few years earlier, these women were not doing this. So this is a kind of photograph which really encapsulates, it shows you, they say a photograph is worth 1,000 words. For me, every time I see it, it really kind of blows me away. So in this particular book, what the authors were doing was they were writing about Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, these 3 countries only. So they weren't talking about Russia or anything like that. But what they were saying was essentially after systemic change, as the title suggests, there wasn't any capitalism and there wasn't any capitalists. But suddenly they had to create the former with the latter, but they couldn't do it because it was impossible, because they were both absent. So it's a double negative trying to create a positive. It simply wasn't possible. One of the reasons it wasn't possible is because the people who came to lead these countries at that time, they weren't hard-nosed businessman coming from Harvard Business School or whatever with MBAs, you know, ready to sack everyone as soon as they stepped into the firm. They were playwrights and essayists and, you know, artists and things like that. So they were imbued with this is from Bourdieu, cultural capital. So they had this cultural capital, right? So, you know, you can think of perhaps the most famous cases, Václav Havel, who became president of Czech Republic. And so they kind of they went on to talk about this cultural bourgeoisie, which they described as a historical coalition of groups and class fractions. Again, historical because they've never been, and maybe never will be again, a period in history, European or otherwise, where such a large amount of states go from one system to another. It's obviously not as clean cut as that, but more or less that's more or less what happened. As I said, kind of culture became in command. It wasn't politics that was in command as such, they argue, and it wasn't economics that was in command as such, again, they argue, which was kind of the case in the Western European core countries, if you like. You know, this kind of says it all. After 1989, capitalism was being made by a coalition of propertyless agents who only yesterday outbid each other in their anti-capitalism. So this is a serious sociological change that everyone had to cope with in some way. And one of the outcomes of this, yeah, exactly. One of the outcomes of this was what they call strong existential ideological forces, which bound them together. So politics, at least in the Hungarian case, in the 1990s, was not particularly filled with animosity. That came later. But at this time, they you know, a lot of the kind of the leaders of the day had gone through this experience together of so many decades. They'd probably all gone to the same universities, they all knew each other, etc. So there was a kind of cross-ideological fertilization there. What I've done is I've kind of inverted the title of the book, and I've called it simply Capitalists Without the Right Kind of Capital. The point is, the capitalism has been made in these countries, well, at least in the Hungarian case, but the others as well. The capitalists that exist there. And they don't just exist there, but they're globally embedded, they're highly networked, they're extremely experienced, they're very wealthy. But the problem is, or their perceived problem, is that the capital streams to which they are privy are not those which they want much of anymore. What they want is a kind of easier capital inflow from the East. Again, I don't want to create a pejorative around this word, but a type of capital, if you like, that doesn't come with the checks and balances, the human rights, and all the rest of it, which typically accompanies Western capital. I mean, it's not completely true, but that's there is some truth in that. I've already kind of alluded to this. So the problem is that they made, as Selin says, they made, in this period when they were first in government, they made a huge mistake. They didn't get the local big capital on their own side, right? And as he says, this is a mistake one does not make twice. They didn't make that again. In 2002, when they lost the election, they only just lost that election, by the way. And in 2006, they also only just lost. A lot of people forget that. But in those 8 years, they really got the big capital on their side. So extremely successful. What is I emphasized the relationship between authoritarian populism and capital earlier. What is the relationship between Hungarian authoritarian populism and capital? Well, it comes in two forms. Quite simply, internal and external. And I will now focus on the two examples of external. So the first one is, as I kind of mentioned in the introduction, this is connected to Paks 2, which is an extension of Hungary's only nuclear power plant. It's in the middle of Hungary. This is it. I took that photo about a year and a half ago before I was chased away by some security guards. So this is what I want to show you, some of the terms of the agreement. This is the cost. This is the loan, very high. This is what the Hungarian taxpayer will pay immediately. When this was signed, this was in 2014, and at that time Hungary's GDP was about 100 billion. So this was 12.5% of the entire GDP, which is extremely high loan. I want to bring your attention to this. So these interest rates for the project are staggered in 4 stages. Here's the data. So this is going from 2014 to 2046, so another 22 years in the future. This is the interest. So they're still paying interest. They just so far they've only paid interest. They haven't even paid back any of the repayment yet. But you can see this is the staggering I'm talking about. So it gets higher and higher. This is extremely risky because who knows what could happen. Luckily, they've done it in euro, but they didn't do it in Hungarian forints. But nonetheless, this is quite a risky agreement. And this actually has there is historical precedent, or I've already mentioned Dr. Buller, who wrote this very good paper about 10 years ago now, on liabilities in Hungary. I think it was in 2007 or 8 or something. For some reason, the Hungarian government at that time decided to denominate mortgages in Swiss francs. When the Hungarian forint crashed after 2008, basically 1 million people could not pay their mortgage anymore because the Swiss franc, so the value of the Hungarian forint became unpayable for most people. So there is historical precedent in our country of taking all these huge loans. Of course, there are a lot of negative aspects and specific risks, and these are in the literature if you want to go ahead and look at them. But right now, I want to focus on some of the advantages of this particular power agreement. So I found 9 of them. There may be others, but I found 9. I'll talk about this shortly, but it gives the potential for Hungary to become an electricity exporter, at least for a brief period of time, and particularly to the Western Balkan countries. It could reduce utility pricing for households. I've already mentioned that's a big political aspect in Hungary. There's EU support. It took a while, but they finally gave it. I want to focus on number 5. So this is a chart of Hungary's energy mix until 2030. This is the gap, and this is a Paks 2 here. So even with this nuclear power plant, this is electricity. Even with this power plant, it won't fill really the entire capacity gap. This is a little bit old now, so I don't know how up to date this is, but it's indicative that there were some sound policy choices around it. It can create jobs. There's carbon-free objectives. The operating costs, once it's built, are very low. And it will provide about 40% of Hungary's entire electricity needs. I mentioned the first one on the top, this potential to become electricity net exporter. This will happen during this period. So these Paks 1, 2, 3, and 4, these are the existing blocks. So these were built in the 1980s. These are the colours here. And then these will come offline. And then number 5 and 6, which are being built now, will come online. And there is a brief period, as you can see, where all 6 of them will be online together. It's a few years. And during this is electricity again capacity. So during this period, this will go above what Hungary needs. So it will become an exporter country, but just for a brief time. So there are, again, clear advantages, and it's due to be decommissioned in 2086. So quite far into the future there. There are, of course, with such an enormous deal, there are some structural impacts for the Hungarian economy. I've already talked to you a little bit about the debt levels. So again, this has not really receded that much. This is 86.9% GDP at 2021 levels. This is the highest in the Visegrad region. And Hungary, as you know, is not in the Eurozone, so its own currency is quite volatile, actually. So it does make it not guaranteed, but probably quite riskier as time goes on. So repayments may go up because, as I said, they're repaying in euros. So we'll have to see what happens to that. It continues this disproportionate reliance on Russian energy supplies. With the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, we don't know how this will turn out, but there's still a dependency there. I've already mentioned about the potential to become an electricity exporter, and it does certainly benefit Fidesz and Fidesz-related domestic actors. So again, domestic capital. Regarding ideology, before 2010, there wasn't really much going on. If anything, it was quite popular because of the talk of colonization and Russians go home and this kind of thing, which was already began in the 80s. Before Fidesz returned to power, it was quite common for Hungarian domestic politicians to be kind of, I wouldn't say anti-Russia, but certainly not pro-Russia. This all began to change in 2010. It's not quite clear why, but one can only speculate. But nonetheless, whatever the causes might be, this has certainly changed. So Hungary is quite a Russophile country, we could say, at least in its decision-making capacities. Yeah, and I don't know how much we can read into this. Whether you think it's good or bad, I don't know. But Orban so far was the first and so far the only EU leader to meet the Russian president since the war began nearly 2 years ago. It was in Beijing a couple of months ago. Okay, the second kind of empirical aspect to this presentation is this is a Chinese capital. So this is the site as it looks. This is the reason, I mean, it's not very interesting, but the reason I'm showing you this is because most Chinese investments into European infrastructure are brownfield sites. So they're going on to already existing space. This is a greenfield site. This is quite rare in Europe. The only other one I can think of is in Belarus. So certainly not in the European Union. So it's quite rare that this has happened. I've already mentioned this is the largest Chinese FDI project in the entire region. This is what it stands for, Contemporary Amperex Technology Co. Limited. So it's the second battery plant in Europe. Does anyone know where the first one is? No? It's in Erfurt, so not too far away from here. It's funny how you don't know that. You don't hear much about that in the German media, but in the German media you hear a lot about this one. So there's a slight paradox there. So as I've already mentioned, Hungary has become or is becoming the kind of meeting point between German and Chinese capitals. I haven't talked so much about the German capital yet, and I will do that now. Where is this plant? Well, it's near to a city called Debrecen, which is in the east of the country, which is the second largest city in Hungary. It's not very big, it's something like 200,000 people. But what's significant is that it always has been a Fidesz stronghold. And this development is really beginning to alienate the population there. So this might have some significant impact on the support for the government in that particular part of the country. Why did I mention German capital? Which German firms are in Hungary? Well, you can see them all here, all the big ones. This one, Audi is also there, but Audi factory isn't near this particular plant. Why did they put this there? What are the batteries for? They're for cars. What kind of cars? Electric, exactly. Electric vehicles, right? Exactly. So, you know, this is all part of the story, and they can't be taken out. So these are German capital and Chinese capital. They're becoming structural factors in this story. It's very important. Here's a map of Hungary. These are the Hungarian battery value chain. These are plants in operation and announced. So fairly recent data. This is Debrecen. So it has almost all the family, or almost all of them. They're quite concentrated in the center of the country, but there's a bit more going on here. But believe me, these are all centered around where the car factories are, right? So it's not a coincidence. This is a staggering statistic. I didn't know this until recently. Basically, if you buy a new car for 20,000 euro, half of that is the battery. So you're spending 10 grand on a battery, basically. So it's, you know, these are expensive things. I don't want to just talk about China, but this is Republic of Korea. So there are a lot of Korean factories involved in this story as well. Another statistic, this is labor. So these are full-time employees in the battery sector in Hungary. You can see this is absolute explosion. This is the kind of chart that a social scientist dreams about almost. It really shows you kind of what's going on here. Who knows what this is for the last couple of years? I just don't have that data. This is the latest I could find. This is expected, so this is the capacity, right, of output by gigafactories by 2031. Look who's top. Look at that. Here's the CATL in Erfurt. Tesla, we know. Surely you know about that, right? And then some others. Why is it that Hungary, a small country, is second? Why isn't France here? Why doesn't France want to get involved? Why doesn't Norway want to get involved? Or UK? These are all very wealthy countries, right? Poland is much bigger than Hungary. So these are obviously clear policy choices that this government has been taking to incentivize the development of this particular sector in the country. So these are the questions that we really should be asking, I think. Don't take it all from me, take it from the founder of CATL. This greenfield project in Hungary will be a giant leap in CATL's global expansion. Chinese like to talk about leaping and jumping. So this will be a giant leap. And I mean, talk is cheap, but you know, these statistics really kind of show that it might be. So time will tell. Here's another little chart from Nidja. I stole this from Financial Times. That's why it's pink. But this shows, this is forecast lithium-ion battery production by country. This is China, right? These are the staggered over the years, these colored dots. So now we might be here somewhere. Obviously, China is way out in front, huge. United States, it's a distant second. Then Germany. Now look here, this is Hungary here. So this is really significant. This is 1.4 billion people. This is 330 million people. This is 88 million people. This is 9. So this is really significant, you know, development choices that they're taking. Look at this. The chief technology officer of Mercedes, no less. Mercedes-Benz will be the first and largest client of the new factory. Maybe they will, but they're definitely part of the story. Now, we need to talk about some potential, I'm coming to the end now, don't worry. So some potential issues. So one problem is that this requires a constant 800 megawatt power capacity. I mean, constant, 24 hours a day, this factory. So this is equivalent of a small power plant. So basically, in other words, this battery factory is a small power plant. So it's synonymous with a small power plant. This is really significant. This is the driest part of the country. It's 1 hour away from the nearest river. It already suffers from drought. So this is serious environmental issues here. And it will need exactly the same amount of water per hour as the entire city, which I've already mentioned. So basically, it's 400,000 people worth of water will be needed every hour, right? That's a lot. A kind of more of a development issue is the risk. One of the big risks here for Hungary and others around it is that it might be betting too heavily and too early on this technology. We're obviously living through this so-called technology 4.0, and who knows what the latest technology will be in 6 months or a year. It's hard to tell. And of course, there are some geopolitical issues. Again, finally, there are some ideological shifts. I mentioned the Russian one. This is the Chinese kind of counterpart. I mentioned these dates already. These are quite significant. There certainly is a xenophilism within the Hungarian government. That's for sure. How far they can continue with realizing these projects is another issue, because, like I said, the Hungarian economy is so deeply owned essentially by Western capital, and there aren't many entry points. So this is probably part of the reason why it's a greenfield site. But this is also, I mentioned this earlier. Hungary has the largest Chinese population in the region. The Bank of China is in Budapest. I think Hungary has something like 4 Confucius Institutes, for example. So there is this kind of soft power aspect of this story as well. Coming to the end. So there are some, what I want to kind of conclude for you is that there are some, some interesting theoretical implications here. I've already developed this Hungarian authoritarian populism. I just gave you a kind of a slightly cursory overview of that. But it also has, if you are kind of interested in this variety of capitalism approach to understanding the economy, it has some serious implications for that as well, because Germany, Hungary, and China each conform to a different so-called ideal type within the literature, and now they're beginning to interact with one. So this is also quite interesting. I've already mentioned, like, HAP, it needs this external capital to keep it going, and so this augmented capital with Eastern states really helps to solidify it. I talked to you about this, but it does mean that the policy choices are still constrained. I keep going on about it, but it is a small country, so there's not that much that they can really do. But they are seeking different kinds of capital nonetheless. We've already talked about some of the tangible alterations. There are these geopolitical questions. It's not really my thing, but there's a literature out there on the new or the second Cold War, so-called, the EU's place in the world, etc., etc., etc. So there are some geopolitical issues around these developments too. I won't go too much into this, but this is in the book. So basically, this is a kind of a sociological approach which talks about countries which are neither the classical colonizer countries like France or Great Britain, or the colonized, so a lot of sub-Saharan African countries or South Asian countries, but those countries kind of in between. He talks about Greece and Thailand as examples, but he leaves the door open for other countries. And in my opinion, Hungary can quite nicely fit this mold, and they don't really know where they stand in the world, these countries. And it's just another way of kind of thinking through their development and their place in the world. And as he writes, they tend to have an aggressively national culture fashioned to suit foreign models. foreign models being, in this case, the way that the political structures and mechanisms developed after 1989, the institutions to which Hungary now belongs, the type of capital that came to dominate the country, etc. And I don't know if anyone in the room would be interested in this, or if anyone could get access, but I would love to learn more about the power of the nuclear or Russian nuclear battery or Chinese battery lobbies. I think lobbyists are a really interesting way to understand a little bit more about the political economy in which they operate. And finally, I wouldn't normally do this, but I don't write books very often. So if you want to spend only £104, you can do so. I mean, Christmas is only 11 months away, so you can think about that for perhaps for your family, but if not, you can probably get it in the library for free.
I already ordered.
You already ordered? Oh, there you go. Save your money. And it's some nice things, some nice people said about it. Thank you very much.